I'm Jo Frances Purdom, and I've been asked to participate in the Lakeside video Lenten Series. And the theme for this week is binding linens. And sometimes we think of binding as something that is a negative thing, but I'd like to think of it as a more positive word because it brings back a memory for me. A few years ago, Dan, my husband, and I went to an elder hostel at a 4-H camp in West Virginia. Dan wanted to take a class in wood carving, and I had to find something to do. So there was a class in quilting, and I thought, well, why not? So I gathered together the required materials, borrowed a portable sewing machine, and off we went. So during the week, I took my class, Dan took his class, and I worked with some other women, and there was an instructor or a guide, master quilter, who helped us cut our pieces, put them together, and the end product was not a large quilt, but rather a wall hanging, and this is the one that I made. Each person brought their own materials, and each person brought different colors. And even though the pattern, which was called Hugs and Kisses, was the same for each one of us, by the end of the week, each quilt looked different. And that makes me think of the fact that maybe our lives are somewhat like that. We piece together our lives guided by God and our instincts. We make our choices, and events happen to us, and so each person's life turns out differently in the end, or as we go along. And I thought, that's a little bit like these quilts. So anyway, but we worked together, and it was fun. We had a lot of camaraderie and pleasure working together, and especially because we had guidance in this project. And at the end of the week, most of us had finished our quilt top, but we had to take it home to do the binding. And the binding is a very important part of a quilt, as any quilter will tell you. It keeps the quilt from fraying, it finishes it, gives it an ending, and sometimes it adds to the design of the quilt. So the binding had to be done at home, and it was somewhat laborious because it had to be done by hand. The pieces of the quilt were put together by machine, and we had guidance and the pleasure of working with other people. But when we got home, it was a little lonelier to put the binding on, and we had to work hard at it. I persevered and finally finished, and the reward was a wall hanging that now graces the wall of our guest room and gives the color scheme for that guest room. How does this help tie in with our Lenten idea? It occurred to me also that Jesus' life as a human on earth also was pieced together. His guide and master quilter as our own was God himself. And his life was a choice of things and the events that happened. And where does the binding come in? Well, his life ended in a way that was not a very happy way, in a way. It was the crucifixion, which is a very, very excruciating death, one that was reserved for only the worst criminals and involved a lot of suffering. So that was, to me, the binding that God provided for Jesus' life here on earth. And the great reward came to us as the recipients of this sacrifice that Jesus made, that only he could make. The reward for each of us was the possibility, if we are believers, of eternal life. And we are grateful for this act of suffering that provided this. This is what we commemorate in Holy Week. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. John 3:16 the lovely King James Version which I memorized as a child, God's binding.